I just want to give you some exposure to the use of geophysics in tackling some hydrological problems. I got into geophysics a long time ago now because I was interested in calibrating hydrological models, actually, and I wanted to reduce uncertainty in hydrological models. And I thought geophysics could offer some additional information to be able to do that. And I think now we've probably reached a stage where we are doing that. But I got distracted on the way doing kind of some other stuff with geophysics. But my kind of career goal has been to try and use geophysics to be able to constrain hydrological models. We've used geophysics a lot in hydrology from many decades, as Nicholas pointed out earlier this morning, and typically using it to look at lithological boundaries. So it's really powerful for this. And often we're not really interested in quantifying properties. We're just interested whether something is red, green, or blue, whether there's a contrast there, like looking at anomalies. And this is an example here where we can see a break in a clay-rich glacial deposits on top of a sandstone, looking at the vulnerability of this sandstone. Over the past 2 decades, there's been a drive towards trying to use geophysics to get quantitative information for hydrological problems. I think sometimes that might be futile, and it actually might be pretty pointless, because sometimes we're kind of searching for this silver bullet in hydrology that actually we might not really need that. And hopefully I'm going to illustrate that a little bit later, and some things that we need to think about. In hydrology, of course, we recognize these dynamic processes, and I think that there's been a big development here over the past couple of decades or so, and in looking at time-lapse processes. They're not new to seismics, of course, but looking at time-lapse processes with near-surface geophysical techniques. Some of this has been driven by remediation techniques, but also looking at dynamic natural processes in hydrology. And as Nicholas pointed out this morning, we can look at geophysics at a whole range of scales, and I kind of wanted to talk about this a little bit today. We can look at the small scale right up to the large scale. There's a tendency, I think, now to think that airborne methods are maybe actually what we need to do, and we need to map out an entire catchment if we're interested in a catchment. Probably not necessary, and Kamini illustrated that nicely by doing this hypothesis testing to answer some research questions by looking at targeted areas within a catchment. But there is a need in some places to be able to map out pathways that might be within a catchment. So we can use geophysics at a whole range of scales with a whole range of different techniques, and the challenge really is to bring all these together to be able to improve a single unifying model of the subsurface. So right down at the small scale, one thing that there's been a lot of work on is actually looking at these properties, rock physics, as Kamini pointed out, look at relationships between geophysical properties and properties of interest. In this case, permeability. So looking at the link between, this is a capacitive time constant. These are spectral measurements over different frequencies here, and the idea is that if you've got grains of a different size, they will charge and discharge on different time scales. And so this frequency represents a characteristic time constant. And we can see here with different samples of sandstone in this case, we can see a shift in this, and it turns out that that shift is related to permeability in this case, to hydraulic conductivity. And Andre Reville and others have been developing some theoretical basis for these empirical observations that we've been making. There's still work to be done here because it's not as simple as I just pointed out there. There's lots of other things that go on. But there's been a drive towards trying to get from a geophysical property something of interest here in hydrology. I talked about this actually at a seminar in ETH Zurich some time ago, and I remember Wolfgang Kinzelbach said to me, "Why are you doing that?" Why? He said, "We can do that. The hydrologists can get hydraulic conductivity. You don't need to do that. Sometimes we actually just need to look at patterns of the subsurface and then use more conventional hydrological techniques to be able to get the properties of interest." We can also move to columns, soil columns, and there's a lot of work that's been done on this, trying to look at in this case, tracer movement through different columns. In this particular project was looking at different types of grass and how they affect the soil structure and ultimately permeability and so on, in a search to try to breed grasses to enhance the soil permeability. So we can use geophysical techniques at this kind of scale look at these pretty small properties. And I've put this slide in because I know Rien van Genuchten gave in his lecture this morning, in his practical class this morning, a session on looking at breakthrough curve modeling. And so you can imagine extracting pixels from this three-dimensional column and looking at the breakthrough curves of those, and maybe getting more insight into changes in this solute concentration at different depths. I'm going to show 3 case studies here to illustrate a range of applications of geophysics. And I picked these because they are things that actually we need to move to a larger scale to be able to tackle. I'm not saying that we've actually tackled it at a larger scale, but we need to, the challenge there is at a large scale. The first I'm going to start with looking at karst. And we have some projects which are running in China right now, in southwest China, which has got areas that are pretty poor, very poor in fact. One of the poorest parts of China is in Guizhou province in the southwest. This karstic environment, which is suffering, the landscape is suffering potentially severe degradation. And there's an interest in actually trying to figure out what the consequences of changing land use is to water quality, to water availability. And what makes this particularly interesting is that because of the climate there, it's a subtropical monsoon, kind of weathering processes that Kamini talked about actually are fairly rapid on a geological perspective. So, and this is to demonstrate that I do go out in the field sometimes, and this is the landscape that we're working in here, and we focus on a small study catchment, which is actually also labelled as a critical zone observatory, and there's a lot of work that's going on in this particular catchment to look at what happens when when farmers move away from working in the fields, what happens to that landscape, and what happens if you start to change that landscape if you plant a whole lot of trees in there to stabilize the soils and so on. And fundamental to this is actually understanding the hydrological processes within the catchment. So when we went out there in this study area, they had some wells installed. There's some sinkholes here. These are sinkholes in this limestone. This is the valley there, as you can see. There's some wells that were installed. There's some springs. And they'd done these measurements in these wells, but actually they were really struggling to figure out why is it that, for example, here I've got an artesian well, and then 10 meters away I've got a fairly dry well. Certainly not artesian. Why is it that I get this well here is responding with a very damped water level response over time, whereas this one shows more of a confined response? So this is the problem with these conventional measurements. We have these point locations, and actually we need to understand some of the connectivity between these. So we set out to try to do some geophysical measurements in this area to try to inform the hydrological conceptual model of the area. And key was actually bringing these data together with the existing data. So I'm just going to show you some examples from this area here and this area here, just to illustrate this. So here's the 2 wells in this part really next to each other, and one of them is artesian, the other one isn't. And we put in a whole lot of resistivity lines in this case. We were constrained by, there's rice fields and so on around here, so kind of constrained by where we could go. But we set this up and then did some electrical imaging, and we can see from these electrical images, we can see variations in conductivity, which don't necessarily tell us exactly where the water is, but we can see that there are contrasts over this kind of scale that would explain this contrast between artesian and non-artesian conditions. If we go up to this area where we see springs and 2 wells that have a different response, so this is well 4 over here, which has this damp response over time, and this is well 5, which has this spiky response, and here is a spring. So running some resistivity lines along here, we can actually see these contrasts. Blue is a conductive area, and we can see this variation between an area which is giving an unconfined response and a confined response. And we can also see along here, along this slope, something that is consistent with this spring there. Yeah.
What do you mean you can see? I see.
Well, you can see. You can see. John, give him some glasses. Actually, well, this is a really important point, actually, with the geophysics, because you do have to wear the right glasses to be able to interpret this. But what you can see here is a very resistive, the red zone is a very resistive area, and there's a break in it. And there's a break in there, and there's a break here too. And we can see this very conductive zone on the surface that we don't see further upstream. So there's a contrast going downslope, not only at shallow depths, but also at some depth here. So there is a change, right? So we're not necessarily seeing water, but we are seeing contrast. We're seeing contrast in the fabric, or contrast in water content, or something, or even chemistry. But we're seeing some changes here. Geophysics on its own is not going to tell us everything. But if we can pool it together with the other data, we can maybe try and untangle this. But when we produced these, and we discussed it with our Chinese colleagues who've been working in this catchment for ages, things started to unravel. Things started to explain why they see different responses in wells and why possibly these springs may exist. Maybe it's not localized. Their conceptualization was probably this spring is some kind of pathway, vertically from the subsurface, locally just there, because that's the only place where you see this spring. But if you look at this, there's consistency along the slope, along here. That line is pretty similar to this line. And actually, if you start delving into the geology, which of course is what you should do in the first place, and we take some geological cross-sections, we can build up, we can see from these geological maps, milestone within the limestone. So areas that are potentially low permeability that might be impeding flow. And if we take these geological cross-sections, we can start to build up a geological model of our catchment, and we see this red line which is marked out where we would expect to see outcrops of this milestone. And this is the area where we've been running these lines to look at these springs. And this is this area where we have this elevated conductivity. So it seems that the milestone in this case is what's controlling these springs. Okay, maybe that's just so simple and so obvious, but it was actually overlooked before that because there was this conceptualization that this karst is basically a series of conduits that are feeding to the surface, or water is sinking through sinkholes into an underground river system. But milestone appears to be critical here, and we observe this. I'm not going to show you the slides on this, but we've observed this on other lines where this milestone shows this contrast. And in this case, we can see the formation of these springs. And this explains why, when they've looked at isotope data from spring water, it's apparently very young. It's consistent with rainfall signatures, whereas when you actually look at the deeper well water, it has an older signature. And so we have this kind of simple conceptualization then of what's happening in this particular area. And as I say, it may be so true, it may seem so obvious, but actually it was overlooked by the hydrologists at the site, just going in and looking at water level fluctuation and groundwater level fluctuation. So the geophysics is kind of important here in actually bringing together that conceptualization of the area. I'm going to move to another application, which is looking at link between groundwater and surface water. And the challenge here is, of course, it's actually very difficult to see what's beneath a riverbed, beneath a water column. And we want to look at this zone because this is this biogeochemical hotspot that has some real interest, particularly when you're looking at redox sensitive species moving through the subsurface. And in this case, the real driver is the legacy nitrate moving through. Sometimes 100 years it might take for it to actually move through from the surface before it enters into the river. So we basically have this this river corridor that is potentially vulnerable to periods when we had elevated fertilizer application. And we see this in the UK, we see this in the US, we see this in other parts of Europe. In China, it's also going to be another issue because they increased their fertilizer application significantly, much more recently, and that legacy is going to hit them later. So looking at this at this UK site, we were interested in the pathways within the river corridor of nitrate-rich groundwater into the stream channel, and we can take out a study area and we can pepper it with piezometers and try to understand the flow pathways as we've done here, and we've thrown a whole lot of instrumentations at this site. And one thing that we did was we did some geophysical surveys, in this case with an electromagnetic device, towed along the river and looking at changing conductivity. We're interested in changing conductivity beneath the water column. Now initially we did this to try to look at the differences in the fabric. So are there areas that are maybe sand or clay rich of these riverbed sediments? It turned out we got more from this. So this is a map. Increasing conductivity is red now, and we see along our reach, this is looking in plan, we see some areas where we have elevated conductivity. And this is actually looking down to about 6 meters with this device. And if we do some shallow surveys, we see the same kind of signature. So we see an area now where in this upper part of the reach we have elevated high conductivity of the riverbed. We've taken into account the water column here compared to the downstream reach. And this geophysical data was really important in this particular study area because it kind of tied everything together. On its own, it didn't tell us what the story was, but bringing it together with the existing data, it kind of made everything kind of fit together, because we had piezometers, so we could look at, and they're multi-level piezometers, so we could look at hydraulic head variation in the vertical. It's an interpolated map based on our piezometer clusters at different points. And then here's a map of our hydraulic head data. And you can see on here that basically we have contrast between the upstream and the downstream. And also you'll see we've got very significant vertical gradients in this upstream part. And this all kind of fits together with the regional groundwater flow movement, which is in this direction, which is driven by a major river course somewhere up in the northeast of the site. We did multi-level sampling. Multi-level sampling looking at nitrate. We're looking at major ions in there, and here's chloride data down to 1 meter. These are our different piezometers as we go down the reach, and we're looking at variations in chloride. And we were interested initially in looking at a mixing zone. But what comes out from here, you'll see the chloride here is slightly higher than down here. And it kind of fits together here that what we've got is a different water source in this upstream location compared to a downstream location. So it seems that this is tapping into more regional flow. This is an upwelling zone, and this isn't. And so here we've got mixing within the shallow riverbed sediments, and here we've actually got direct upwelling of nitrate-rich groundwater. I'm not saying that we see nitrate with our geophysics, but we see something which is a geochemical signature because there's a contrast between shallow groundwater and deeper groundwater. So we see a contrast between these upstream and downstream sites that makes sense, because here we've got this strong upwelling, and we've got more lateral flows horizontal flows in this downstream section. And this was the driver for the hydrology here, was to try to understand the redox processes that were going on in the site. So what is a denitrification process occurring there? So hydrology was the basis of that biogeochemical model. And geophysics then played an important part in trying to bring it all together and understand what was happening over the reach. Now this is only a small study area, 200 meters, but you could then extend that over to a larger area, maybe even use your geophysics as a reconnaissance tool to be able to target areas that you would go in and do more detailed investigation. The third case I'm going to show is on using geophysics in in looking at the root zone, in this case as a proxy for soil moisture, and not as sophisticated as the kind of things that Kamini was referring to here. But the driver for this is food security. The driver for this is plant breeders trying to understand, they want to maximize yield, and they want to understand water content, and they want to measure water content beneath their crop. In this case, it's a winter wheat. And measuring water content directly is a challenge. If you were going to do this over a huge breeding field, then it basically it's just not really an option. And you're limited to a small scale, and it's too invasive to be able to do these kind of measurements, and far too expensive to do this over numerous plots. We're interested in trying to look at saturation and using conductivity as a proxy, but conductivity is affected by so many other things to do with surface conductivity, clay content, and your porosity and so on. So using conductivity alone is not going to tell us moisture content, but perhaps if we look at changes in conductivity, we can see changes in saturation, because other things may be actually staying the same. The structure, the texture of the soil is going to stay the same. So that's what we've been focusing on here. We've got these plots with multiple wheat breeds in there, and we're looking at variations of the responses of these. We've got some fallow fields you can see from these aerial shots, and each of these different fields have got replicates of different wheat varieties that are being grown here. And we initially set out by using some electrical imaging techniques. We were laying the cables over the surface and doing some imaging there. And this is an example in a sandy rich soil. We see changes over time. So this is, we infer this is getting drier beneath this, and we're looking at the drying front end of this due to water uptake. You see this is a fallow plot where we don't see that drying zone. Now the depth of drying was going down to about 40 centimeters in this case, and it turns out that there's an iron pan layer that's not continuous, but you see this iron pan layer across the site, and it seems to kind of control the variation there. If we go to a clay-rich site in the same year, so we're running these in parallel, then we see this drying front move down to different depths. Now the plant breeders, they kind of want to know, I want plants to be able to get the water from different depths, if you think about looking at drought tolerance and so on. And they want to be able to see whether different genotypes actually are extracting water at different depths. So this has been our focus, and we've been trying to compare then our signatures from resistivity, changes over depth, changes in conductivity with changes in moisture content, in this case from neutron probe, to try to see how much information we can get from that. And even though our studies are fairly small scale from a plant breeder's field perspective, there is a potential that in using geophysics at a larger scale, and I'm sure that Sander will actually give some examples of this kind of thing in his presentation after mine. So there's a lot of interest now in geophysical techniques applying in the shallow agricultural context. But there are challenges here, and I'm just going to finish by giving a few examples of some challenges that we're facing. The first one, credibility across disciplines. Now, this becomes apparent when you start working with plant scientists and so on, and you're looking at generalizing your results, how some of the conventional approaches to using geophysics may not be appropriate. We are faced with, and Kamini alluded to this a little bit, with a lot of n=1 experiments, and that's a kind of curse of hydrological sciences in many cases. But sometimes we need to be able to think about running replicates where it's appropriate, to be able to get something that is not seen as anecdotal. And this is particularly important if you're looking at some high impact output in an interdisciplinary context. So rather than actually just having a single slope where you say, okay, I see preferential flow, you need to generalize that. You need to draw some generalized conclusions from that to be able to put your results in a broader context. And in many cases, we kind of ignore the uncertainty in our estimations. So bringing in how does this all propagate through? And Nicholas talked about this in his presentation earlier. How do we bring in our uncertainty in our petrophysical relationships, in our observations, in our model, in our data, to be able to say, actually, what does this mean about uncertainty in our estimates of the thing of interest, moisture content, permeability, and so on? And there's a lot more that I think we need to do to be able to kind of put error bars and so on our results. Sometimes there's a bit of geofantasy that goes on there. This is a classic example. This is published. This is a GPR profile in a plant sciences journal, and then this is straight from the paper, and then this is the interpretation from a 2D profile, and a resulting picture is what it said. And of course, the plant scientists are not going to probe into, well, really, what about all these reflectors everywhere, and how do you deconfold that signature to get that? Sometimes there's a bit of geofantasy, and we've got to be careful with that. Here's an example, actually looking at the propagation of noise. This is a synthetic model. If I add noise to this, and I know what the noise level is, in this case 5%, and I do an inversion. This is as good as I will get with the classical smoothness inversion. If I'm the pessimist and I actually assume that my data has higher noise, I of course don't get all the information from the signature, and I get this weaker signal. The danger is the optimist. The optimist then says, oh, actually my noise levels are much lower. And then they get all these features. Now in this case it's a simple model, I know the result. But the danger is that the minute you start interpreting this, go back to my cast example, you start interpreting this and say, well, I've got all these features in here. So actually assessing the noise levels and the propagation of that are really important to be able to understand what is an appropriate level, appropriate geophysical signature. There's a lot of work that's been done looking at plot scale experiments, and I've shown you some examples here, but we need to move to larger scale in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases move into a larger scale. Sometimes though, we can actually target, we don't need to map out with airborne geophysics the whole area necessarily. Sometimes we can just target areas which are actually really important. And Cameron's examples were really good there, and actually looking at key processes that might be occurring in the landscape. We might target the river corridor, because that's actually the area where things are happening that are actually important to us. So we need to think about larger scales, but we need to think about not imagine that we're just going to map the entire area out with geophysics, because that's really not going to be feasible. But there is development, of course, as you would expect, that's going on with UAVs and so on, that might be able to assist in some of that. And no doubt there's going to be some rapid technological developments that we see in the very near future as these come out and are used within a near-surface geophysics context. In many cases, we actually have multiple data sets. And again, going back to Nicholas's talk, really nice presentation there, talking about how you actually can bring in a Bayesian context, how you can bring in multiple data types to be able to constrain your model. We're not really interested in the end of the day about a resistivity image or a GPR profile. But we've got all these data. We've got borehole logs and we've got water level responses, and bringing those together, the fusion of those data to get a single unified model is a challenge. There are computational challenges there, but also some challenges with the appropriate methodologies. And so this is something where I think that there's a lot of scope for further development there. Bringing multiple data sets together to be able to get a single unifying model. So in summary, I think that there's been some big advances in the kind of field of hydrogeophysics over the past couple of decades and so. There's a lot of methodology development, but right now we see a kind of nice integration of geophysics within many hydrological studies. It's seen as a key part of hydrological studies, and that demonstrates that it's really adding some value. I think there are growing opportunities in an agricultural context, and if you bring in the critical zone side of things as well, I think that adds to this mix. Sometimes I think mapping boundaries is actually still very effective use of geophysics. It's kind of bread and butter kind of geophysics here, but I think it's still very powerful in hydrology. But the rock physics is still important here, actually understanding why you have that contrast and to be able to kind of interpret your geophysical data. And I think that some parts of rock physics have been kind of held back as we move towards doing a lot more on inversions, a lot more modeling and so on, and less on actually understanding these basic properties. I think in some cases we did a lot more statistical rigor, particularly as we actually want to increase the impact and we actually want to move to applications in an interdisciplinary context. I think we need to measure, as I said, my background was looking at uncertainty in hydrological models and using geophysics to constrain uncertainty. I think in hydrology there's an acceptance of uncertainty. In near-surface geophysics, less appreciation of that, and I think that there needs to be more of that to illustrate these fuzzy images and what they actually mean or what they might not mean. And there's a lot of plot experiments that we've been doing, a lot of plot experiments, and I think that there's a need to move to taking these to some larger scale investigations. Is this on the agriculture? Yeah. Did we monitor the different what?
The water content between the different fields of the species?
No, we just did it. We actually did the measurements right in the center of each plot, assuming there was no boundary effect. So we were away from the boundaries. So
if one species is growing a lot faster than the other one, they might influence the water content from the neighboring field.
I'm not sure if I understand it right. So our neutral probe measurements were right in the center of the plot. Right, and we consider them as the measurement being far enough away from the boundary not to have an influence, not that we don't see a boundary effect, or we don't see an influence of the neighboring plot. Now, whether that's actually a valid assumption, but we've done our measurements at, within the center of that.
The question was there one species along one line, or were there different species along one?
No. Each one species is actually a 7 meter by 2 meter plot.
And you sampled many of them?
Yeah, there are 4 replicates of each species, and there are multiple species. There's 24 different species, 24 different genotypes, and 4 replicates. So the key variation is actually variation of soil type within the field. But by having the replicates, you could actually remove that with a random block design. One thing that I've kind of labored for a long time is you need to quantify your measurement errors and you need to quantify your model errors. And I think in any inversion process, you need to understand what is the appropriate stopping point and have an objective measure for that stopping point in your inversion. So if you assess your errors in your measurements and assess your errors in your model as much as you can have an objective way to actually be on the right level and not be overly optimistic or pessimistic. Other people will have different approaches, but errors are remarkably often ignored with these geophysical surveys. For the wheat plot, it was 30 centimeters. 30 centimeters in this case. And we moved these to using like electromagnetic devices. I didn't show those there, but the whole driver for this was actually trying to do these equivalent surveys with electromagnetic instruments. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, so you could look at the dynamics of that with these sensors in localized plots, and that would, if we're doing our sampling here with the geophysics only on a 2-weekly time scale, then you look at the dynamics, the short scale dynamics may be important to be able to help with that. The thing I said about the sensors was the challenge is that if you imagine you've got a field with 1,000 plots, you cannot get multi-level sensors in 1,000 locations to be able to do that.